In 1933, the President of the United States made it a federal crime to own gold. 10 years in prison, $10,000 fine. Americans were ordered to hand it all in, every coin, every bar, every ounce. And then, once the government had collected it all, they did something with that gold that made the whole thing even worse. Hey, and on Money Origins, we dig into the history of money, power, and the systems that shaped both in ways that actually make sense. Today, we're going back to one of the most audacious financial moves in American history. Here's what we're covering today. First, we'll set the scene. What was happening in America in 1933 that made this even possible? Then, we'll walk through exactly what Executive Order 6102 said, what it demanded, and what happened if you refused. After that, we'll look at the twist, what the government did after collecting all that gold. And finally, we'll zoom out and look at what this whole episode tells us about money, power, and who really controls both. Stay with me through point 3, because that's where the story gets genuinely hard to believe. To understand the 1933 gold confiscation, you have to understand just how bad things had gotten. By 1933, America had been in the Great Depression for nearly 4 years. Unemployment was somewhere around 25%. Banks were collapsing, not one or two, but hundreds. In just a few years, thousands of banks had failed, wiping out the savings of ordinary people overnight. And here's what made it worse. At the time, the US was on the gold standard. Every dollar in circulation was supposed to be backed by a specific amount of gold held by the government. That system worked fine until people stopped trusting it. When banks started failing, Americans did what people have always done when they lose faith in paper money. They ran to gold. They lined up at banks, withdrew their savings, and converted those dollars into gold coins. It's called a bank run, and by early 1933, it had become a national crisis. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like when an entire economy starts to crack? This was it. And Franklin Roosevelt had just been inaugurated. He had about 5 minutes to figure out what to do. On April 5th, 1933, just weeks into his presidency, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. And what it said was remarkable. Every American citizen was required to turn in their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1st, 1933. In return, they'd receive the official government price, $20.67 per troy ounce. That was the legal rate. You didn't negotiate. You didn't shop around. You took the $20.67 and you said, thank you. Now, what if you didn't comply? The penalty was up to 10 years in federal prison, a fine of up to $10,000, or both. In 1933 dollars, that $10,000 fine is equivalent to well over $200,000 today. This wasn't a polite request. This was the government saying, hand it over or else. This is the moment in the story people always stop and ask, was this even legal? And here's the honest answer. It was legally contested, it was politically explosive, and it absolutely happened. The executive order was issued under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which had been amended to apply during peacetime economic emergencies. Roosevelt declared a banking emergency, and that gave him the authority, at least in the government's interpretation. There were some exceptions, which is worth noting. Jewelers and industrial users could hold gold for legitimate professional purposes. Rare and unusual gold coins, ones with recognized numismatic value, were also exempt. And there was a personal exemption of up to 5 troy ounces that historians generally acknowledge, though the order's language was strict. But for the average American holding gold savings, you were expected to turn it in. Let me simplify what just happened here. The US government, in the middle of an economic crisis, told its citizens to surrender their gold at a price the government had set. This is the part of the US gold confiscation story that tends to stop people cold. After collecting gold from American citizens at $20.67 per ounce, after threatening imprisonment to anyone who didn't comply, the Roosevelt administration passed the Gold Reserve Act in January 1934. And that act officially set a new price for gold: $35 per troy ounce. Let that land for a second. The government bought your gold at $20.67. Then it revalued that same gold at $35. That's roughly a 69% increase, an instant profit of nearly $3 billion in 1934 dollars, now sitting in government coffers instead of in the hands of the people who handed the gold over. This wasn't an accident or an afterthought. The devaluation of the dollar against gold was part of the plan. The government needed to expand the money supply to fight deflation, and repricing gold was the mechanism. But the sequence of events is what matters here. First, collect the gold at the low price, then revalue it. The people who gave up their gold at $20.67 never saw a cent of that 69% gain. Now, in terms of factual fairness, there are economists who argue that Roosevelt's actions helped stabilize the banking system and pull the US back from a complete monetary collapse. That case exists and it's worth acknowledging, but it doesn't change what happens to ordinary Americans who surrendered their savings at government gunpoint and watched the value of those savings jump 69% the moment they were out of their hands. This is the callback to how we opened. The government didn't just make it illegal to own gold, it made it illegal right before the gold became significantly more valuable. Here's something that surprises a lot of people about the 1933 gold confiscation. The ban didn't end in 1933. It didn't end in the 1940s. It didn't end after World War II. American citizens were legally prohibited from privately owning gold bullion until December 31, 1974, when President Gerald Ford signed legislation restoring that right. That's 41 years. An entire generation of Americans grew up in a country where owning monetary gold was a federal crime. During that period, the U.S. maintained the $35 gold peg internationally, meaning foreign governments and central banks could still exchange dollars for gold at that rate. That system held together under the Bretton Woods Agreement until 1971, when President Nixon closed the gold window entirely, severing the last formal link between the dollar and gold. By then, the U.S. simply didn't have enough gold to honor all the outstanding dollar obligations at $35 an ounce. And that brings us to the closing thought, the one worth sitting with. Quick note before I wrap. Nothing in this video is financial advice. This is history and context. Always make your own informed decisions about money. So here's where we've landed. The 1933 gold confiscation, Executive Order 6102, happened because the Great Depression pushed the U.S. banking system to the edge of total collapse. Roosevelt's response was to force Americans to surrender their gold at $20.67 an ounce under threat of prison. The government then repriced that gold at $35 an ounce, a 69% gain that went to the Treasury, not to the people who gave up the gold. The ban on private gold ownership lasted until 1974. But here's the broader point that I think makes this story matter beyond the history books. The United States government built an entire monetary system on gold. Gold was the foundation. Gold was the guarantee. Gold was what made a dollar worth anything. And then, when that gold standard became inconvenient, When it constrained what the government could do, they dismantled it. First, by taking the gold away from citizens. Then, by breaking the international peg. The system that was supposed to protect the value of money was abandoned by the very institution that created it. That's the thing about monetary history. The rules always make sense, right up until they don't. If you found this story as wild as I did, I think you'll appreciate where we're going next. The next video on money origins is called How Ancient Money Predicted Bitcoin: The 4 Properties of All Currency. And it connects some of these same ideas about value, trust, and scarcity all the way back to the ancient world. It's a different angle on the same big question: what actually makes money work? I'll see you in it.